let us kick this thing off. So first off, with everybody jumping on the call, the biggest challenges that people are facing right now is they are searching for an idea or they are trying to find mentors. And there's a few others around that as well. And where people are at in their founder journey, they have an idea, and that is exciting. And then a few people have shared across the other parts of the spectrum. That is awesome. So Vinay and Vishal will be able to dive in deep to all of those things. So I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Patrick Gallagher with the Engineering Leadership Community team. I support all of our different events and contents. We are so excited to have you joining us here today. We not only have just incredible engineering leaders joining us today, but everybody here are in the process of becoming founders or interested in becoming a founder. And so this event is really special, specifically because we have members of our community, the San Francisco Engineering Leadership Community, and our friends from South Park Commons who are joining us as well, all of whom are in the process of becoming a founder, which is really, really cool. So for our friends joining us with South Park Commons, let me give you a quick intro and some context of who we are as an organization and what we do. As the Engineering Leadership Community, our mission is simple. It's to empower engineering leaders. So we have over 5,000 engineering leaders from CTOs, VPs, directors to team leads from over 100 cities all over the world. And we host a ton of different events, conferences, and podcasts to support engineering leaders with all of the different challenges that they face, mainly through two programs. So we have our regular events, which cover a broad set of engineering leadership topics, but we also have our reserve program, which is this event today, that's focused on getting to know what the needs are of engineering leaders so they share their challenges that they're facing. And then we curate specific topics in a more intimate space to address them. So in this case, we've had a number of our members share, I want to become a founder and want to learn how to start a company. What do I do? Well, we invited Vinay and Vishal to dive into their story to share the lessons that they've learned along the way. So that's our organization and what we're all about. If you'd like to see more of our past events, you can check us out at sfelc.com, sign up for our newsletter, and get plugged into all of our future events. There's some really cool things coming up. But that's why we're excited, because today is about discussing the founder's journey. And the truth, and what many of you may have found, is that building a startup is hard. There's a steep learning curve if you have never started your own business. And the demand for execution is really high. And there isn't a whole lot of room for do-overs. You sort of have one shot, and if you don't move fast enough, somebody else will likely capitalize on it. So taking action and making sure you get it right is critical. And one of the most effective ways to do that is by learning the story of other engineering leaders who've done it. And so we're joined by two great examples of engineering leaders today who've successfully made that transition, Vinay Hiremath and Vishal Kapur. Their conversation will cover things like how to find the right idea and validate it, how to find product market fit, importance and challenges in execution, decision-making frameworks, and the successful habits and beliefs that they've found to be effective. And so our time together is going to follow a very simple flow. Vinay and Vishal are going to chat for about 30 minutes. And then we'll have a few of our community members joining us live for specific questions that they have in their challenges. And then we'll have a more broader Q&A. So first, though, before we dive in and bring up Vinay and Vishal, I'd like to welcome up Mary Anto from South Park Commons to share a little bit, welcome us from South Park Commons and share a little bit about what they've got going on. Mary, welcome. Great to have you.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you. I'm really happy to be for South Park Commons to be doing this event today in partnership with you guys. So I just wanted to introduce to everyone here what South Park Commons is. South Park Commons is a collective of technologists, thinkers, and entrepreneurs who have come together to freely learn and explore ideas. We believe good ideas very, very rarely come about in isolation. So we've created this environment to help each other take risks and launch our next endeavors. We consider ourselves an anti-incubator, a safe zone that promotes judge-free exploration and development of new ideas. Members do a variety of things: start companies, work on open source projects, study new domains, and pursue research, etc. We don't judge the impact of our members' work as long as what they're working on is ideas they're passionate about. So we're a pretty small community. We have about 200 members, including Vishal today, who have collectively started 34 companies, managed over 20 open source projects, and published over 20 papers, books, and articles. So if you guys are interested in joining South Park Commons, we are always looking for new members. Please contact me or visit the South Park Commons website after the talk. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. And I love the idea, or the focus on ideas rarely come in isolation. And that's what makes conversations like this so important, in groups like the engineering leadership community and South Park Commons coming together to create those types of collaborations with their ideas. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of this for everybody joining in. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our featured speaker today, Vinay Hiremath. Vinay is the co-founder and CTO at Loom, where he oversees the architecture, infrastructural, unit economics, scaling, and output of the team, as well as the strategic technical direction of the company. He was named Forbes 30 under 30 in 2017. Before Loom, Vinay worked at Up There, a cloud computing startup where he gained most of his technical competency in service architecture and distributed systems. Before Up There, he worked at Backplane, a social network startup for celebrities. Welcome, Vinay. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate
Absolutely.
that.
Wonderful. Well, let me introduce our moderator for today, Vishal Kapur. Vishal was the co-founder and CTO of Screenhero, a collaborative screen sharing app acquired by Slack in 2015. He was then engineering manager of the Slack Calls team. And since leaving Slack, he's been exploring what's next out South Park Commons. Vishal, take it away and let us dive into the founder's journey.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. And thank you to you, Jerry, Mary. You guys really did a lot of the legwork of making this happen. So thank you guys for everything that you put into this. Yeah, so I wanted to get started. You know, Vinay and I actually met, I want to say it was 2015 or 2016. I don't know if you remember, Vinay, exactly when we first met, but I was still at Slack at that time. And I remember at that time when we met, you guys weren't working on what you're working on now. Right now, you're doing kind of asynchronous video. Back then, I believe you guys were doing user testing based on kind of easy to do screen share videos and stuff like that. And so, and I think from what I remember from those conversations is you guys have gone through a couple of ideas, especially in those early days. There was a few different things that you had to evaluate, some iteration there. You know, what you're doing now is kind of adjacent, but not really in the same market, not quite the same product. And so I think what I was curious to learn more about is how you guys went through that process. You know, how did you go through that process of iterating? How do you know when to let go of something and try something new? I think this is something that we all struggle with, especially in the early days of figuring stuff out. So I'd love to start there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. We were called Open Test, which coincidentally is extremely difficult to like recruit your first few people to your team when you're building a video product, but your company is called Open Test and people are like, we have no idea what you're doing. The first time me and Vishal met up, we were actually going for a walk, and I think we ended up hanging out in Yerba Buena Gardens.
Yes,
like
I remember that.
Yeah, and we were just talking about kicking the can about like management, scaling the team, and iterating through some of the ideas back then. So basically the way that we started is we started as, well, me and my two co-founders, we started a user testing company. Really, we just hopped into it because we all had product experience, and we basically chalked up starting our first company as it's going to fail. I mean, I forgot what the stats are. I think it's like less than like 2.5% of companies that get started make it Series A or above, which in today's figures is like a Series Seed or pre-seed or whatever crazy amount of funding people are getting at earlier stages. But like we basically just said, look, we want to build something where we have a culture where good ideas are rewarded and celebrated, and where leadership has a really strong backbone and sticks to values that drive their decision making, and they stick to those decisions through they see those decisions out through outcomes and then pivot from there. And so, and obviously we didn't start a company to lose money, so we wanted some good financial outcome for ourselves and early employees if we were lucky enough to make it there. And we jumped into user testing simply because me and my co-founders are just doers. We started by trying to set up this weekly meeting. It was the most unsuccessful experiment in the history of our relationship as friends. But basically, we set up this meeting where we wanted to go through what markets could be disrupted. And basically, Shahid, my other co-founder, was like, hey, like I've had this idea about doing better user testing, and all of us are makers. So we're like, yeah, let's just do that. Let's do that. And we like basically didn't do any more of the like 30-minute meeting. Like within the first 5 minutes, we just jumped into this domain. We started with something we called the Expert Network, which was really just me and my co-founders putting up a forum and asking people, hey, like submit your website, submit a link to the App Store, and ask us like 5 questions about the flow that you're needing to get answered for you, because maybe you don't have the expertise near you. Maybe you want to like get something around your checkout experience checked out by like a quote unquote product expert. And this at first was just like a website that dumped into a Google Doc, and we actually used a Google Sheet as like our database for an embarrassing long period of time. But we went from there and just validated that people wanted this and would pay for it. And we pivoted into what was quote unquote called the Expert Network, where it was basically just our friends who felt bad for us doing this for us. And so it was them doing it where they recorded with QuickTime or whatever, or like there was something called Silverback as well. And it was just these like super janky applications that didn't work all the time, like oftentimes like resulted in corrupted video. And then they drag and drop and like upload the video into like the janky CMS that I had built, where they then had to like wait for the video to process and then fill out their notes and submit this user feedback to a company for a lump sum of $60 when they're getting paid, you know, $175K a year. And it was just like not a good outcome. And eventually they were like, look, we really like you guys as friends, but we're not going to do this anymore. And at the same time, our customers were like, hey, we'd love to get this kind of user guided feedback from our actual users, like our actual users that are on our website. And so then from there, we pivoted into a Chrome extension that recorded video guided feedback, because we realized, hey, people don't want to install applications. We definitely won't be able to get people on a website that are just visiting it normally to do that. And at the time, Chrome had an inline install tool that made it super seamless for somebody to do it right within the website experience. And so we took the Chrome extension, we paired it up with a JavaScript snippet, and we basically surfaced up this like quasi NPS form that was smiley faces. It was like, how was your experience today? And there was a smiley face, like a kind of neutral face, and then a frowny face. And as soon as they answered that, we'd say, awesome, thank you. Like, would you like to submit some some video feedback? You just have to click the install extension button here. And then it would just like, boom, pop them into a flow where they'd be recording their feedback about what they're seeing on the screen and submit it to the website owner. We pivoted in that space for about like 4 months or so. We probably did like 4 or 5 different pivots in a 6-7 month period where we were bootstrapped off our own money. And, you know, we were running out of money. Like quite frankly, we reached a point where we had maxed out our credit cards, and each one of us had like 2 weeks left. And none of us come from families where like our families are super well off. So it wasn't like 2 weeks and then your parents are going to like back you and you'll be fine. It was like in 2 weeks, you need to start a job like right now, because the bank will not give you a loan. And so we kind of found ourselves in this period where we realized, okay, we need to do something. And as a Hail Mary, and it was more than just a Hail Mary, we had been building a hypothesis in the background. And that's where I'll get back to the core of your question, Vishal, about how do you validate ideas? How do you like let go of them? And how do you move on, at least through the framework that we moved through? We essentially said, okay, let's decouple the Chrome extension, because this thing uploads video at the same time that someone's recording, strictly because people didn't want to wait to submit user feedback. It had nothing to do with like the technical capability of it. And so we were like, this quick video tool might be useful. Let's unlock it. Let's launch it on Product Hunt. And then hopefully the traffic would funnel back into the user testing platform, which absolutely was not working. And I have no idea why we thought that was a good idea, but we were like, we're really strict on this like user testing platform. We want to double down on it. Maybe that'll help us raise venture funding. And the interesting thing is that I kind of like, this is an extremely simplified version of how I look at different states that founders are in. They can be in a ton of different states. And I try not to be like overly dogmatic or prescriptive about any of my advice, because there are so many backgrounds of people with so many different circumstances starting companies. But I think there's like fundamentally two different types of founders. One are the founders where they say, hey, this is the version of the future and we're going to build it no matter what, because we know that this is where the world should go. And then there's founders where they come across an idea and it's really up to you as to whether or not you want to hop on and ride the rocket ship. And we were squarely in the latter camp. And now I find myself in the former camp. And so when we launched, we called it OpenBid at the time. And that's when I was talking to you. When we launched OpenBid, it started taking off. People were signing up. There were a lot of really interesting like customer support cases. Like I have this one example that I tell people all the time, where this guy reached out and he was like, hey, I want to repair my video. There's green lines on it. And I was like, sure, but I have to look at your video to know whether or not I repaired it. Is that okay? And when I opened it up, it was this guy, like a floating cam bubble, the Loom cam bubble, a stock ticker going down, and him just like screaming at a screen in Portuguese. And I fixed it, and I had to ask him. I was like, yo, I know that you don't have to give me the answer. I don't understand the language that you're speaking. But I'm really curious about what's going on here. And he was like, me and 6 or 7 other people in Brazil have over $150 billion worth of assets under management. And one of my partners just made a very bad decision. And I thought your tool was the perfect way for me to express how disappointed I was in the decision he just made. And there were like a lot of these light bulb moments. And all of a sudden, Loom started transforming, or OpenBid and then Loom started transforming from this thing that was a hypothesis that we were working on and evolving into something where we understood the macroeconomics. We're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. The world is rapidly distributing. Like work is becoming more and more remote. Internet speeds unilaterally are raising around the world. People in Kenya and Lagos, Nigeria are just like skipping laying down fiber lines and going straight to sat internet. People are getting more comfortable with video. And so there were all these things that were happening that started like clicking, but it did involve a lot of like murkiness and pivoting through the darkness for us in the user testing space. And so I wanted to draw that picture. There are like a number of fundamental ways I think you can go about validating a hypothesis. This would be one of the biggest things I would start with, and it actually ties into another question that was in the poll. I think a lot of people said, I want to look for mentors. The best way to find a mentor, like actually really good advice that I had read from Paul Graham, the best way to find a mentor is to ask for the most directed, smallest piece of feedback that you can get and show progress over time, especially if that person's time is really, really tight. And so if you show progress over time, even if they don't respond to you, and this could be in the form of like developing your hypothesis as a group that's working on a problem, you're showing that you're like investing energy and learning and becoming smarter as a group. And that's like fundamentally that progress, being able to watch that progress is really key, not only for mentors, for VC too. Like I would strongly, strongly recommend that if you're starting a company right now, you have your founders, reach out to the people that you want to raise from, even if they're at like a level above where you think you can go. See if you can find someone who can intro you. And if not, reach out to people that are angels who might be a little bit more accessible, and start like sending them newsletters of your progress, like week by week, and make sure that you're shipping a lot of stuff, because that comes off super impressive. And by doing that, that will force you to hyper focus on areas that you need to validate as fundamental underlying assumptions. But you have to start with some hypotheses, and it's going to be really crude at first, and then just keep innovating and pivoting, and make sure you find product and technical people that are like fearless about just being able to jump into a new thing. I'd never built a Chrome extension before. I'd never built like a lot of the things that we built at Loom before. But I just kind of took it on the chin and jumped in. And I think that's like really important for your early technical team.
That's great. I mean, there's so many things in there, I think, that we can kind of talk more about. I love the kind of bit about mentorship and kind of, even in how you deal with potential investors, just kind of the general philosophy of, doing a lot getting things done and sharing what you're doing with other people. It's just super valuable, I think, in general. And kind of, this idea of kind of having a team that works well together and is kind of fearless in terms of, what you're approaching. And I want to kind of dig into that a little bit more because, finding co-founders is another, I think, challenge that a lot of people find at this really early stage. And it sounds like you guys, as a team, were able to stay together. I mean, I think that's like kind of step one is, can you stay together through all of those ups and downs? You're 2 weeks away from having to get a job, which is like, the end of the road kind of that journey. And yet through all of that, you were able to stay together. You kind of sound like you moved as a team from idea to idea rather than kind of fragmenting, in different directions, which can happen. And so talk to us a little bit about kind of how you found your co-founders and what are the elements that you think kind of made that work well for you guys?
Yeah, those are great questions. I was going to say about the fearless technical sort of thing. I mean, I guess that is, it is like, I'm over ascribing a solution. I don't know what market anybody who's, watching this is in. Maybe that's not like applicable. That does tend to be more applicable to things that, look, if you want to pivot, like the more fearless you are about pivoting into new spaces that you don't know, whether or not it's technical, it could be the business model too. The higher clip that you'll be able to try something radically different. And Vishal, like you had hyper technical co-founders. So if anything, I'd say you're even more of an expert at this than I am. Your team I was the only technical founder at Loom. I'm trying to think about like how to best answer the questions.
Another way to frame it is like, if you were kind of doing this again and you're in a similar position of starting from scratch again, and you're looking for that team, that group of people that you are willing to go down this path with, and now like you've been in it for like several years now, you're starting to get great success with Loom, so you can look backwards and I'm curious what your insights are, is what has kind of worked well in keeping the team together, making it cohesive. And my personal philosophy is that the kind of ability of the founding team to work well together and just basically to enjoy working together, and also to be able to kind of weather all the ups and downs, I think. And the more uncertainty there is, the more kind of fragmented you can get. But I think it works best if you can be kind of on the same wavelength. And looking backwards, what did you see that really made that happen for you? Like, what are the qualities in the co-founders? What is the kind of nature of the relationship? What's the kind of background of how you met your co-founders that you think, these things are actually really important to have, and maybe there's some things that aren't important. Like one of the kind of things that you hear a lot is you need to have worked with your co-founders before or know them. And I don't think that's actually true, but I'm curious like what your perspective is on some of these things.
Totally. I was trying to think about like how I would back out and like think about, I think the first thing is that you fundamentally have to understand what your relationship with work is, right? Like, and the reason why you have to first understand that is because I generally think the best relationship is when everybody has like equal levels of commitment, or at least like an understanding of the commitment level. It's just like any other relationship. In fact, I almost think that your co-founder relationship, as you go through ups and downs together, ends up being a relationship where you can talk to them about things that you would just find it impossible to talk to anybody else about, because you are trusting like Maslow's lowest hierarchy of needs, which is you being able to provide for yourself and other people, and your identity is so caught up in it that the equal commitment just has to be there. If somebody is pulling nights and weekends and working every single day, and then another person's doing a couple hours a week, it's going to fail. You're going to build up resentment. So that would be the first thing that I would nail down. And I don't want to be prescriptive there, because everybody has like totally different situations. For me and my co-founders, we didn't we didn't and still don't have kids. You know, we knew that we were going to go all out on this and make this our entire life for that few months, but not everybody has that. Not everybody has that life setup. And so I don't think it's fair to say that like, that is the only way to go about it. What I will say is that that will drastically increase your chances of success. And that's just a fact, because at the end of the day, getting lucky is how much time, how much tenacity, and how many ideas can you churn out? And how can you do it in a way that is smart, where you're building on that hypothesis? And smart is in quotes, because we're all working under imperfect information. Like, that's the whole game of life. And so that's where I'd start. I'd say that things that I found really useful, me and Joe and Shahid are like brothers. I mean, we've been through danger together, like real danger, real life danger. We've been on like adventures. We've gone out and partied together. We knew each other pretty well, and we formed these relationships during pretty transformational years for each one of us. Joe had dropped out of college with only one semester left, which made his parents very happy, to start a company in LA, and then moved on to other full-time jobs. He didn't even go to college. He actually just went from high school straight out to the Silicon Valley to work as a designer, and then eventually got into VC. And then for me, I dropped out about halfway through college. And so we were all kind of in California. And funny enough, our parents live about 20 minutes away from each other now, just coincidentally. But we never met each other in Illinois. We met each other in California. The story of how we met each other is pretty long. I mean, the TLDR is that I met Shahid while I was interning at Backplane, that first company you were talking about, Patrick, the first company that was like the social network startup, which really was just Lady Gaga's social network, which is a thing I won't go into. And me and Shahid met there when he was interning. And then me and Joe met when I decided to randomly go down to LA because I couldn't scalp tickets for an electronic concert in San Francisco. And so I met Joe because I didn't know anybody in LA at the time, except for my cousin. And there was no way me and my cousin love each other, but there's no way I'm going to spend an entire weekend with her. And so as I was going down there, I only knew one person, and that ended up being Joe's childhood best friend, who I tangentially knew from U of I, where I went to college. And so I met Joe that way. And then I connected Joe and she went down to LA to work in VC. And so that's a really long story. I didn't do a great job narrating it, but I think the TLDR is that you should definitely find people you trust. Trust is like incredibly important. I'd say that along the lines of founder relationships, even if you didn't know the person a lot before, you should make an active effort to get to know them personally, like on a regular basis. Hang out, like do random things. I know right now people are distanced. Just hop on Zoom and, grab a beer and like talk about life. Or if you don't drink, like coffee, whatever, like do a pizza party, whatever works for you. Just get to know that person and get to know them like pretty intimately. And I'd say also the number one thing whenever I give advice to earlier startups that people screw up on is that they don't do regular founder check-ins. Like they think because they're so early on, because they're working all the time, that they don't need to make a space for venting to each other. And like 90% of the reason why me, Joe, and Shahid were still able to make it work and like grow the business is because on a weekly basis, we basically told each other the things that we didn't like about each other. We're like, I don't like that like you're approaching this problem in this way. Like when you approach this problem this way, I thought that was really dumb. And like, I think these are the only people you'll be able to have that kind of relationship with. So the more you can get out of like creating, I know that with other employees, you want to create like a psychologically safe space. That should just be assumed. Like you are all like putting so much of your time and energy into this company that it should just be assumed that everybody wants the same thing. They want what's best for everything. And so the quicker that you can get that feedback to your other co-founders on a regular basis, just do like a founder dinner every Sunday for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. If you don't have anything to complain about, that's great. Just spend time celebrating and talking about things, but put like an hour and a half, 2 hours on the calendar every week and just keep in touch with your founders. Talk about things that you could be doing better and things that went really well and give each other praise.
I love all that. I mean, trust, transparency, actually getting to know your founders well. I mean, it's just like all so critical. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think the other thing that I have on my mind is, okay, you had your co-founders and you're iterating through this idea. Now you kind of find what eventually is going to become Loom. You start getting a little bit of signal, a little bit of traction that there's a market there for this, but it's still early, and you're still probably trying to figure that out. You're trying to figure out exactly, what the market is and how viable it really is. And yet I imagine there's some point there where you're trying to recruit other people to join you that are not founders. And, those early hires when, it's not where you're at now, where Loom is clearly on a trajectory towards, awesome success. It's that those early days, like how do you attract people at that stage to take a risk on something that is definitely not a sure bet? And there's many other, choices that great people have in terms of what they can do. And so, talk to us a little bit about kind of your experiences with that, and what are some of the challenges that you had there in the early days? What are some of the things that worked for you and didn't work?
Yeah, totally. That is a great question that I don't have a complete answer to be honest. Like I've seen it work. So I almost wish my friend Gabby, I wish she was on the call because she did a fantastic job of this, like finding early employees, basically being a solo founder, and she's just generally a badass. So I wish I had her on the line so she could give her input too. Because there is a way to do this by, raising funds after getting traction and then essentially de-risking with salary and some high equity upside. And I think you're gonna end up having to do that anyway. And it could be a whole conversation about the actual offer. But what I'd say is that, for me personally, and I don't know if this applies to everybody, but for me personally, what ended up happening is over July 4th weekend, actually leading up to that, I had been hanging out with Paulius, who was the first hire. And Paulius was a good friend of mine. He was at Yahoo before that. He was at Yahoo through the acquisition of Brightroll, which was a video ads company. And he was miserable at Yahoo. I mean, Yahoo was just like a horrible, horrible place to work. And I think everybody knows that. And so like Paulius was like deeply not happy. I'd kept trying to like tell him, hey, you don't have much to lose out on. You're an amazing engineer. Just come like work on this thing. We'll give you a salary. We'll give you some equity. And like, let's see where this goes. And he kept saying no, like rightfully so, because he was making good money at Yahoo, and what we could offer him was just way below base. But at a certain point, like basically we had gone to the Lost Coast and gone on a long backpacking trip. And that was actually 4 years ago, almost exactly. We went out to Lassen National Park over the weekend just to like kind of memorialize that moment. But after the hike, I ended up asking him again, and I was just like, look, you can stay at Yahoo, be unhappy, or you can find a new job, or we can work on this thing together and try it out. We're like still pretty young. We don't have like a lot of responsibilities. What do you say? And he hopped on, because where he was at Yahoo, I knew that his skill set and where he was at Yahoo was just like, there was such a large vector there. And he was still junior, like relatively junior or mid-level. I'd say that honestly, I was too. Like I squeezed a lot into a small period of time. I wasn't looking for people that were like hyper senior. I was looking for people that were very, very hungry and wanted to like work on this and just iterate and have a win, like had a chip on their shoulder with some level of self-awareness. And so that's really where I found Paulius, and thank God I found him, because I tried to recruit like 5 people before that and it all like fell on its face. So when I say I don't have like a great answer for this, it's because my answer would be try to recruit your friends who are like just unhappy at their job. And even if you can't bring them in full time, like see if you can bring them in part-time, see if you can bring them in part-time and like do like a contract to hire or something. See if they're like bought in. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. for us at that time, it was really important that it was all or nothing. We needed somebody who's full-time. I was a solo founder, technical founder for like far too long, like tens of thousands of lines of code had been written. We needed somebody on full-time, but if you're not in that position, I'd say inch your way into that relationship and see if they'll just dedicate like a few hours a week or something and see if there's a good vibe.
That's great. I wanted to switch gears a little bit here. There's a couple of other kind of things I want to touch on. There's so much more I want to dive into about kind of Loom's early days story, and hopefully we'll get a chance during Q&A to kind of go more on that. But I wanted to actually switch gears to kind of, one of the things that I'm always really curious about is what are the sort of kind of habits of mind, your kind of belief systems, your kind of worldview. What are some things that you think have kind of changed that in a meaningful way? And, how has that kind of connected to you being an entrepreneur? And I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on that as kind of something that's been meaningful to you personally.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that like probably, for most people, their worldviews are going to be so radically different that I'll tell you about mine, but I can almost guarantee that most people wouldn't embody the same ones. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, like 30 minutes south of Wisconsin, in a really small farm town, and people would ride into school with like Confederate flags on their truck, and like the N-word was like frequently used. And so that's where I grew up, right? And so I built like a pretty thick skin and a pretty like big chip on my shoulder from growing up in a place like that. Examples of things that I had to deal with were people telling me that white girls would never date me because I was brown. Like, brown people like really need to stay in their place, and like this is where they're at in the social hierarchy, like all this kind of stuff. So my worldview, and on top of that, I was born with something like what I affectionately call a broken operating system. I was born with like I've struggled with depression and social anxiety from like a young age. Would sometimes like be in bed for days and have like infections and like problems from not being able to get out of bed because I just didn't see any point in it. And so I had to work through like this, like I had to drag myself out of this well. And some of the things that kind of formed for me through all that, like really one is that when I found a way out of that mental hole, and like part of this has to do with experimenting with psychedelics. Like I'm a big advocate for psychedelics, like blanket statement. It's really dangerous if you have other issues of like past psychosis or other problems. Like please don't take my advice here and just start like going on a shroom trip. Like please do it responsibly and talk to somebody who knows what they're doing. But it really helped me like turn around almost 180 degrees. Like it completely changed my life. And so some of the things that I really care about transparency and truth. I think it's like super important to just be as upfront as possible and treat people like adults, and just assume that other people assume positive intent. So you assume positive intent, and you assume that other people assume positive intent. And if they don't, just try to bridge and help them understand where you're coming from versus like tiptoeing around an issue. So transparency is like super, super important to me. I have a very open relationship with my parents. I've told them about like all of the substances that I've experimented with. Not everybody has that kind of relationship with their parents, right? And so that's one thing that I think has like been really critical for me becoming a better engineer, honestly. It's just like finding the absolute truth of what's going on and being a pit bull about it. Like just not giving up until you understand like why something is happening. And so for me, like we're talking about entrepreneurship, but my main goal in life has been to be the best engineer I could be. And that still applies today, even through starting the company. And so, a lot of people talk about breaking down problems to like first principles and how it's like this great thing that like everybody loves. Like fundamentally breaking down problems to first principles is an exercise of looking like an idiot over and over again and not liking the other person. Like if you're doing it right, you should get into a place where every like assumption is fundamentally challenged. And you can only really get to that point if both people really care about the truth. And you have to like care a lot more about what you don't know than what you know, which is like it's another principle that I really care about. People who care a lot more about talking about what they know, I generally don't like spending time around people like that, because I know that if I do, my ego will take over and I'll start identifying with that, and then I'll plateau myself. Another principle that's been really helpful, there's this 45-minute talk by this guy named Osho, who was an Eastern philosopher. He's kind of crazy. There's this Netflix documentary called Wild Wild Country that I definitely recommend. You'll probably discredit a lot of what he says if you watch that before listening to this, but he's crazy. He like has this idea. There's this 45-minute lecture called The Joy of Living Dangerously. And basically the idea is that if you are not taking on danger, if a life force within you is not at risk in some way, you're not actually living, you're dying. And so the idea is that if you're not taking on spiritual risk, if you're not taking on financial risk, if you're not taking on emotional risk, if you care about respectability more than taking on risk and like speaking your truth, you're not actually living. Like that is the definition of death, because you don't actually exist. And so that concept of taking on increasing risk is something that I try to do in my life in general, because I've had to do it in order to even be able to have this conversation right now. Like the social anxiety that I used to have, everybody says that I'm an extrovert. I'm actually incredibly introverted. This entire protocol of me being able to talk to people was all learned mechanically. It feels very natural now, but you know, I think that like getting through that, you have to really care about doing the risky thing or the thing that scares the shit out of you in order for like the upside. And there might be a downside before there's an upside, and you have to be like okay with that, because fundamentally you have to think that stagnation is dying. And so I definitely highly recommend The Joy of Living Dangerously by Osho. It's provided me with like an immeasurable amount of value in my life, like from relationships to Loom to dropping out of school, basically everything.
I'll have to check that out. I haven't seen that particular that particular talk, but risk is definitely like something that I think about a lot, and I think we think about it usually just in terms of kind of financial risk. But you're right, there's all these different dimensions, and kind of life in some sense is kind of fundamentally risky. And so part of what we try to do is manage the risk, right? Because it gives us anxiety, but that, what's the kind of, what are we limiting ourselves when you try to control it too much?
Yeah. And I will say that again, like this is just the reason why I caveated it with my own philosophy is because I'm not at all advocating that if you're living paycheck to paycheck and have like 2 kids to support, that you do this. That's irresponsible and like not very empathetic to people that rely on you wholesale. So I do want to caveat that the relative level of risk totally depends on your situation. And people who kind of like, there's this culture of hustle porn where it's like, yo, you need to like go out and like work 16 hours a day and like forget your relationship and forget all these like obligations you have. Like that's totally up to you to decide. And it's really like, I've learned to be super weary about people who give blanket advice, especially when it comes to life principles.
So there's so many more things I would love to dive into there, especially the psychedelics. But there's another kind of topic I want to touch on here before we get to the live QA. And it's this whole kind of, this topic right now, which is just on a lot of people's minds, which is remote work. With COVID, obviously that has accelerated a lot of these trends that we were already seeing towards distributed work, remote work, sort of hybrid work too, where some people are co-located and some people are remote. And I think what we've seen is there's a lot of attention around synchronous working. There's the Zooms of the world, that there's a lot of attention on how do you make that experience better? How do you make live going to the gym live over Zoom better? Okay, here's an idea there. Or how do you make collaboration better? Here's an idea there. And obviously Screenhero was along those lines too. But I think what's really interesting about what you guys are doing at Loom is really this focus on async. So async video, and I think that's it's a relatively newer. You do see kind of async audio being used in other countries like India, South America, a lot of countries in South America. People on WhatsApp, for example, will do a lot of async audio messages. So there's something kind of culturally there, which is maybe a bit different than what we have culturally here. And I imagine there's a similar kind of thing in work cultures too, where culturally certain companies and certain types of work are kind of a fit for this asynchronous type of working in a way that other companies might not be. And I'm curious to kind of dive into that a little bit. What are the things that you've seen there, and what do you think are kind of unexplored opportunities in sort of asynchronous communication, where if I'm somebody who's interested in this whole area, I see that, collaboration is a big thing and it's only getting bigger. People are working remotely, and maybe I haven't looked at the asynchronous side as much. Like, what are some things that you've seen there that are kind of interesting things that, could be explored more?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's, my thoughts on this are like constantly evolving, even now, even today, especially totally unprecedented times of remote work increasing artificially, like to 100% for a lot of knowledge workers. I'd say that so there were a lot of questions there. I'd say the first one is that, it's kind of crazy to me that we have a lot of this synchronous communication, right? Like we have synchronous chat, which is, chatbots presumably, or like IM. Like you assume that someone's going to get back to you pretty synchronously. We have asynchronous chat, which should be how people use Slack, but actually isn't. And then you have things like synchronous video, like the Zoom call we're on right now. And then there's nothing else. And so you're seeing like a massive industry come out of this. There's like many different ways we're doing like synchronous video. There's many different ways that people are doing async over just like stand-ups versus like the horizontal use case of Loom. And I love it because fundamentally, a lot of times, like even when COVID started happening, I probably talked to about 40 to 50 different founders or C-level execs at different companies that I know, not only the US and Europe too, because our company took funding from Point Nine, which is a German VC firm. And so I talked to people like along the gamut of many different cultural backgrounds. And the thing that became very obvious to me is that they thought that I was hopping on a call to pitch Loom. And fundamentally what I was hopping on a call for was, hey, you've just switched into a remote atmosphere and now your employees have like tons of meetings back to back. Like your entire calendar schedule for an engineer is like 5 hours of meetings. How do you expect them to get deep work in and do their actual job? And so like, it's not even about Loom or, Zoom or using Notion or Google Docs. It's more like, how do you evolve your culture to be more async first in order to prioritize deep work? And this is fundamentally for a lot of companies, an issue of trust is what I've found. It's actually a trust problem. Like, it's not that they want people to, like the sales team at X company that I will not name. It's not that they want people to hop on the synchronous sales pipeline call, daily stand-up, versus just dropping in async notes, whether it's a Loom video or not. It's not because like they think that's more important. Like the only data you get out of a meeting really is, first of all, the quick molding of the conversation, if that's important, like for a session like this, or just like facial expressions. Like that's really the number one most important thing that you can get out of a meeting, in my opinion. And so how do you front load as much of that information before you take everybody's time away from them on a calendar? Like the coordination problem is so expensive. And so that's how I think about async versus sync. I fundamentally, sometimes I'm hopping on sales calls And I'm talking to companies where I'm like, whoa, before you even like start thinking about Loom, you might want to start thinking about like these other things. And then they come back later and they're like, oh, that was like much better. And so I could talk about async overall. I think that to touch on your questions around like voice and cultural differences, I fundamentally approach most product decisions, and I know Joe does as well, my co-founder, and Shahid does, with complete apathy. Like, I think you need to build, like the best product makers I've met truly believe that any product you're building is just an annoyance at first to the person. Like they're really looking at it as, this is just getting in the way of me and my next coffee break. Or, you know, if I'm in IT at a big company, this is another goddamn contract that I need to like deal with. And like, it's just annoying, right? And so you fundamentally have to fall back to, is this efficient? Is this making people more effective at their work? And the reason why we chose video and we stuck with video is because a lot of times you want to pack a lot of information density into what you're sending somebody. And sure, you could send a voice message. You could talk to somebody and that gets like some level of expressiveness over, which is a form of data. And it's also it's more useful to decode as well, because you don't need to be watching your screen. You can put your headphones in and listen to the voice message. But you get a lot less dense information. And we just thought that it made more sense to start with video for our use case, although new use cases are popping up around voice. I'd say the nice thing about video and voice in general, but especially video as it relates to cultural differences, is that video is a format that internationalizes itself automatically. And so even if you don't speak the language, like if you don't speak English and you land on a loom.com share video, if you're able to know that that's a video element and you can press play and the person who's talking to you knows you can understand that language, you can get the message and you can decode it. And this is especially useful in a world where English is not like the first language of a distributed team. Like it might not be, right? Like if you're hiring people in Argentina, maybe Spanish is the first language, right? Maybe Portuguese is. And I remember this one specific instance that really drove this home. I was doing some user testing with like some user interviews with a company called Cloud Factory, which does machine learning scrubbing for companies like GM Cruise and these autonomous vehicle divisions. Their business and product units are in North Carolina. And so I talked to the product manager there. Everything was like normal. They're like, yeah, we use Loom to record videos detailing bugs. I was like, okay, cool. I've heard that before. I talked to their engineer in Lagos, Nigeria, and it was mind-blowing because I asked him what Loom was unlocking for him. And he was like, Loom is actually allowing me to keep my job because I've been fired from other jobs by doing the wrong thing, because before bug tickets and like Jira tickets had this wall of text where I have to like translate this language into, or I have to read the language, which is a language I don't understand, and then translate it into the language that's my first language, and then hope that I'm like doing the right thing. I have to hope that I'm doing the right thing, because if I don't, there's a 7-hour time zone penalty of doing the wrong thing. And that's when it like really clicked to me that like, okay, video, there is implicit information value in the high fidelity interaction of sharing your screen or recording a video over some content. So that way, even if you don't understand the language, even if you don't understand the cultural nuances, the fact that I'm pointing at something that's a visual language that we both understand is incredibly powerful and reduces back and forth. I think the last part of your question was like different areas for opportunities within remote. I'll just keep pitching this. I know that Chris at First Base is working on this, but if there could be companies that standardize the PEO contract relationship with employees as you expand internationally so that the legal overhead is taken care of and it's cheaper than what's offered right now, that would be a huge time saver. And if you could couple that with an IT and hardware provisioning platform, that would also be awesome. Because right now what happens is like you end up having to have a headquarter, or you end up having to order a laptop at the closest like Apple store or whatever, and then farm it out to your remote employee. If there was a single place for all of this to be handled, we would pay like handsomely to have that service. And right now we use a hodgepodge of different services and an internal team to manage that. So that would be like the number one thing that I'd plug, and I continue to plug, because it allows remote companies to scale.
That was fantastic. Thank you for that. And, I think there's this idea, this insight that you have of kind of trust being something that kind of changes the culture of a company and kind of allows them to use different tooling to make remote work kind of viable, or different modalities work better, I think is a really, really great insight. I think at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick to kind of have some other folks bring some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Vishal. And thank you for the thoughtful questions. And Vinay, thank you so much for sharing your story, especially for the challenges that you dealt with and how you helped build mechanical processes to be more effective. I think that was incredibly insightful. We have a ton of questions for you lined up. So our first session is going to be bringing up a couple live participants. So Stanley, if you are ready to dive in.
Yeah, sure.
Jump in and share your challenge or question that Vinay and Vishal can help you out with.
Thanks, Patrick. And thank you, Vinay and Vishal, especially Vinay, for sharing so openly about your various experiences, your own struggles. I think it's important for leaders to share those stories so it knows it's okay to talk about them. I guess my question is to dive deeper into like how it's been scaling out Loom now that you found more of a product market fit. You raised your Series B with Sequoia and like other. But the associate is you touched briefly on the very early stage, like convincing your friend who was miserable at Yahoo to grow out. What other phases did you notice as the team grew from that point onto where you are now? And maybe there are some signals that you thought you saw, so you were able to preempt it, or some things you might have missed, and what comes out there.
Yeah, it's a good question. I was actually talking to the first employee at GitLab, who's a senior EM on their infra team, about this. And the question I like to ask is, what was your favorite chapter of the company, like team size wise? And Vishal, I'm sure you have an answer here too. But for me, one of my favorite periods was when we were like 6 to 10 people. Like it was like communication was really easy. People were able to literally just stand up and like voice their concerns about things. And you knew in like a shouting distance, or like if you were to type in Slack, everybody would get that context almost immediately. There were just less people problems and less communication and organizational structure problems. It was harder to recruit because you were less well known, but you also recruited the right people because it was so polarizing. You're so early on. So I would first answer with that question, is that like 6 to 12 sort of team size. I really like that team size. It's right around when you probably want to start thinking about at least somebody dedicating time to your people operations as well, whether you hire someone in full time or not. I will say that, there have been different chapters, and I think the more important thing than just team size to focus on is actually like, are you at a place where your team is able to pause for a little bit and gel, or are you growing? And that, if anything, I've at least seen, although I don't know if this is like a universal truth, it's something that I'm still building up in my head. I at least have seen that you're in those two types of modes, because we've grown a lot. Like we're at 90 people. The engineering team is at 30 people, including management. We started at 13 at the beginning of this year, and we'll end at 50 to 55 people within engineering by the end of the year. So the eng team will have grown by 5x by the end of the year. And so like with those types of growth numbers, like there's a lot of growing pains. And so I'll speak less to like just the team size and more like relative scale and how that, like, I've kind of seen that affect things. Within remote specifically, some of the things you need to watch out for are centers of gravity and time zone lag. And so an example of a center of gravity would be a key decision maker. If you have your PM working on a cross-functional team where the engineering and design ICs need like continual input and jamming with that person, but that PM is like in Australia and the engineering team is in Amsterdam, like good luck, you just played yourself, because like the communication lag is going to be massive. And so within remote teams, I really try to think about, my advice would be, as you're scaling, think about the countries that you want to scale within. I would just pick like a few time zones at first, because if you spread across like multiple countries, you end up taking on a lot of legal complexity later on when your company reaches past that magical 50 employee number, which I'll let people look into employee labor law as to why that is. But like there's a lot of things within that I think that just like sticking to like a 3 to 4 time zone spread early on will get you really far. That being said, that comes at the cost of not being able to find really good talent outside of that, which is one of the huge pros of remote, which is also why I plugged that PEO contract legal firm as like the #1 idea that I'd love to get tackled. I'd say the other thing that I found is that the maturity of, as you're recruiting people in and your startup becomes more well-known, you end up having to raise the technical bar, you end up having to raise the design bar. And so finding a really good leadership team, especially if you're scaling fast, if you're scaling fast, finding people that are good by your cultural values. And for us, the things that make me really happy about the leaders that I work with at Loom is like an unbridled sense of optimism at all times, like almost like just psychopathically so. And then 2 is that they are super accomplished, but still not afraid to roll up their sleeves and get the work done, which means that they earn a lot of respect from the ICs on the team. And so like, I would say finding leaders that are in that sweet spot, for me, that makes for a much stronger maker culture. I have a pretty strong opinion that I know there's like a lot of non-technical EMs and non-technical directors. I personally think that's really hard to pull off early on. I think you need to be technical over whatever technical surface area you're watching for, because otherwise the team just won't respect you. And you're kind of up against like the reptilian brain, which is just like, good luck. And so I think that like those are some of the other scaling things I'd call out. Man, there's so much that I could dive into. Like, I guess to kind of corner the question a little bit more, are there things around like process that you'd love to hear about? Is it specifically around hiring? Like, would love to deliver it, just corner the question to deliver as much value as possible.
I think you actually answered the question in a surprising way especially around remote work. I guess I think now I want to dive a little bit deeper into that one. When you're starting out a company, I can understand like when you want to, hire works from like basically not the Bay Area and not have to pay at least 6 figures to be considered like reasonable living conditions. But there's also comes at a cost of that, like time lag, the distance, not being physically in a room, but nowadays it doesn't really matter. But prior to that, do you actually recommend like starting your initial like 10 or 20 hires like across several time zones? For me, I've generally biased toward like you should start your core team or like your first 10 people, like cross-functional team together in like one spot. That way you should all fit into like one like small home or like 2-bedroom apartment or something. But do you want to counter that?
Yeah, I think that, either one works. I'd say that for co-founders, I personally have liked being in that energy and like being around the 2 co-founders, like Joe and Shahid, but I'll say that it can work out any way. It really just depends on what journey you want. I'd say that the #1, there's only one guarantee, and it's that if you have bad people on your team or people that don't deliver, you will fail. And so as long as you optimize for good people, like things will turn out all right. Like it might not be exactly where you want it. It might be that somebody is like in Amsterdam and you're like, oh crap, okay, that's kind of a problem, but this was the only person we could find and we really need somebody on the team and they're really, really good. Like I'd say take it. Like for me, I just look at, I look at talent as so much harder to get, especially if you don't have all their wins under your belt. You don't have anything that can attract people in, that if you're finding yourself in a place where the choice is like okay or good talent closer to your time zone or like really good talent that's like super hungry and aligns with like your values and that you like hanging out with online, like take that person. And so it doesn't directly answer your question because I think there's like multiple ways you can go about it and people have shown that you can do it either way. Like DHH from 37 Signals was in Amsterdam when his co-founder was in Chicago. I really don't like DHH and Jason Fried. Like I genuinely, I just philosophically disagree with a lot of their thoughts, but they made it work and they're doing pretty well. He's rich enough to be a Le Mans winning race car driver. So I think that they've hit some level of success. I'd say that, it just depends on where you want to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Stanley. We have a couple more live participants. Quick request. We have a lot more in the Q&A, so if we could do some rapid fire, that way we'll cover a lot more. So next up we have Yad. Yad, do you want to jump in with your question?
Absolutely. Thank you. Hey, Vinay. I enjoyed everything that you mentioned, and I somewhat related to a lot of them. So I imagine that you see a lot of problems around remote and distributed work. Which one of them do you see to be more temporarily versus some of them being more permanent from your perspective?
That's a really good question. There's one that I'm not sure of, and I'll give that answer first. So the one that I'm not sure of, and Patrick, feel free to cut me off too. I give pretty voluminous answers, and I won't take it personally. I want to make sure other people get a chance to chime in. But the one that I'm not really sure of is, mentoring and up-leveling junior ICs, specifically within engineering. I find that process accelerates way faster when they're in person, and you can find someone who's like highly autonomous and can do it based on their own willpower remotely. But I think that's like difficult. I know that Sid from GitLab takes a very different approach to this, and he probably knows more than me, to be completely honest. Like he's scaled a company way past me and has been in the remote space like way longer than me. So I defer to his judgment, but this is one that I'm not really sure whether or not it's a fundamentally human thing or whether or not it's solvable in the long term. I'm hoping it's solvable, and we're going to try to tackle that, but a lot is like unknown in that space of like training and onboarding, specifically with junior people. I'd say that a more a long-term trade-off is one that you can solve for by hiring. I think that when you hire a massively distributed or remote team, you're fundamentally buying into a different set of principles than people are when they really want to be on site, right? And I generally find this correlated with age and responsibilities. So people that are younger, that are in a city, not when we're in the middle of a global pandemic, work is a lot of their life, and they know they're investing a lot to up level really fast and find new opportunities. And so they want to hang out with these people that they're spending all their time with. If you are a parent of like 3 kids, you want to optimize your time with your family. And so like there's 2 different fundamental sort of value systems that are at play here. And I think that it's important to like understand that when you're going remote. And it's one of the reasons why we've taken on a hybrid model, because we actually want to have both people, but that makes the operations of your communication infinitely harder. And it's like unknown whether or not you can solve this in a good way. We think that there is a way. And so we have a San Francisco HQ, and then we have people distributed from Australia to Poland. And we're starting to spin up more people on the East Coast to do a different time zone hub, and we're going to see how it works. But the truth is that I don't know how it'll work. And hybrid, usually the really hard advice is that either go fully remote or go completely co-located or some idea of satellite offices. Because if you go in between, you're basically committing to the async comms, even when people are in person, and then you have to make sure people agree to it and stick to it. I think that there's a way. This seems solvable, but that's the other thing that I'm not really sure about is the hybrid approach. But we're traversing that, and I'm sure that we'll release a bunch of blog posts about how we fucked up. So hopefully nobody else has to.
Awesome, thank you, Yad. Vinay, a quick follow-up question from our Q&A related to junior employees and execution. And so this person mentioned that you shared that you considered yourself junior at the very beginning of the company, and that your first hire also was considered junior. After you raised more money, did you have to refactor much of the initial code and architecture? And if not, like, how'd you make the best decisions early on with that type of relationship?
Yeah, so junior is probably pretty strong. I'd say we were like mid-level with the amount of experience we had. We had about 3.5 to 4 years of experience out of college, like more mid-level, definitely not senior. Although myself and Paulius poured a lot of time into working. And so we were kind of in this weird place where technically we were very, very strong, but mentality wise, like what we had seen in the field, we were pretty mid-level junior still. And so I'd say that the code, like right now we joke about how like 80% of the initiatives at Loom are basically undoing fuck ups that we made like early on, like technical mistakes that we made early on in the process. And so there's definitely a lot of refactoring, a lot of reworking the systems. But if anybody here hasn't read like Evan Weaver of Figma, his blog posts, there's one that he has on how they made their design system sync system, their collaboration system work. And he's fundamentally like, do not over engineer your system. Do not make it like super scalable. Just solve what it needs to do at first and then go from there and make sure you don't architect your way into a corner. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. I generally agree with that philosophy. I think over engineering, especially early on, I'm guessing for a lot of the people who just have an idea or are looking for mentors, I'd focus on value delivery, but just not at the expense of, absolute crap code that you won't ever be able to move and will like cripple you in the future, which is like a subjective balance, I suppose.
Awesome, thank you. Another quick question that I wanted to send to both you and Vishal, just related to fundraising, because both of you have really unique backgrounds and pathways to starting your companies. Did you find that either of your backgrounds helped you during fundraising? And this person who shared the question feels like they constantly hear that you have to have a certain type of background, whether that's, being from a big school or from a large corporation to be like evaluated favorably by VCs. Can both of you share like, a quick take on your experience with that process and how your background factored into that? And any advice you'd have to somebody maybe who doesn't have the quote unquote big school perfect background?
Yeah, go for it, Vishal. I feel like I've been talking a lot, so.
I think my short answer is I'm not sure. I don't know that I've really, like when we were going through that process, I was really paying attention to those sort of things as much, and it's a little hard to judge without actually, some kind of direct comparisons. So I think, my guess is it probably did have a factor in terms of, school background and stuff like that. I think the bigger factor though was when we were raising for Screenhero, that same team, we had been doing an iPhone app before that called iTeleport, which was like a remote desktop application for your iPhone. And that was fully bootstrapped. But when we were talking to VCs, we could say, hey, look, we've been working together for years now. At that point, it had been 2 or 3 years. It's the same team. We've kind of had that longevity, and we had some kind of moderate success with that too. And it's also like in a similar technology space, a similar product space. I think those things are more of a signal. I think, those things to some extent are accessible to kind of anybody that's trying to do this. And I think kind of to what Vinay was saying before, it's kind of, this idea of building stuff, being productive, constantly moving your feet is how I think of it. And telling other people about it is just hugely valuable. And I think there's less gatekeeping around this than I think maybe we think. I mean, there is definitely some, but there's, compared to other industries, there's a lot more, I think, accessibility in tech for these type of things, which makes it great, I think. And that's my optimistic perspective. Of course, there's always specific cases and specific circumstances in our life, which kind of makes certain things difficult. It makes kind of our ability to be able to get to that point, just different, I think. So it's definitely not a one size fits all type of perspective, but that was my take, I think.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think the only thing I'd add is that, if you are in a position where it is very difficult, like you both need money and you're trying to start a company and like things aren't working out because the gatekeeping is stacked against you, like I also like to think of my life in stepping stones. And so definitely if I just dropped out of school and had gone straight for starting a company, it would be significantly more difficult to raise capital. Like I went from startup to startup. I agree with Vishal though. Like I also have Facebook on my resume as like, even as an internship, I think it helps and people are pattern matching. So by nature, so they're going to look at that as signal, even if it's not. And the number one thing is what Vishal mentioned, which is just like work ethic and showing results. But it will be more difficult for you if you don't have things that people typically pattern match against. And maybe it's not even big school or like big company. It could also be, if you don't have big school or big company, but you have like patents in the video space, like that would have definitely made my life a lot easier to raise money early on. So, but I didn't, so.
Thank you both for that. I think illustrating the pattern matching piece and providing signals. So if you lack maybe a certain defined signal, being able to create or cause other signals that creates confidence helps people figure out those patterns. I think the patent pieces that you were mentioning, Vinay, is a really interesting way that didn't even occur to me, is like that could be something that you could provide that helps hedge that. Awesome. We have another live participant, Asal. I'd love to bring you up if you'd like to share your challenge. Asal, jump on in.
Sure. Thank you, Vinay, Vishal, Patrick, Mir, and everyone who helped make this great talk happen. Now I have a question. So I wanted to take your perspective on bringing external funding or VCs. When is the most appropriate time to balance between, still having, external funding and money, but also making sure that your decisions are kind of stemming from your mission or vision, and it's not very externally impacted or affected by external factors.
I mean, I can say something really quick about that. I think my perspective on it is, when you kind of take that jump and you take VC money, in some sense, you're kind of committing yourself to work on this thing and with this group of people for a pretty long time. Like it's 5, 7, 10 years plus sometimes of your life. And I think that's a big commitment. And I think that's, to me, like that kind of trade-off of kind of, what do I really want to spend my time on? Is this it? And if I feel like it is, and we found that, like in Vinay's story, they iterated through a few things and then they found something that kind of excited them and felt viable, then to me, that's the time when it can make sense to kind of double down and say, okay, I'm going to commit to this for a longer period. It's not just about kind of what VC money can do in terms of, like adding fuel to the fire and kind of the rocket ship mentality and all of that. I mean, there's all of those dynamics too, but to me personally, the bigger thing is, the level of commitment and like conviction that I personally have.
Yeah, same sort of thing. And that could be based off of, within conviction, that could be based off of like how big you and your partners think the opportunity truly is, right? Like if you don't think that it's like really big, but someone's willing to write you a big check, one piece of advice I typically give people is that I usually say, if you can wait until you have some traction, some revenue before you raise funds, like it's always preferable. I know a lot, like people are in different situations and some people literally can't take the step until they get funding. And that's just the situation they're in. And maybe that's the reality, but if you can, like, I highly, highly suggest doing that first, like even as like a part-time thing, building something up until you and your friends, or whoever, hopefully you like them, hopefully they're your friends, but until you are all like, hey, this is really cool. Let's start raising, or maybe you keep people in the loop, even though it's, part-time commit until it goes more full-time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I think a follow-up question that's in the Q&A related to negotiating the different priorities and dynamics of, external funding. So this one person mentioned in the Q&A, were either of you ever in a situation where you said you would focus more on the business and strategy and less on the technology as your primary contribution? And I guess I sort of interpret that as like, was there a point where you made a conscious decision to focus on the business, the strategy, maybe like the profitability and the business side of the business versus the technology that you were building within the engineering team and the product? So if either of you have any insight on like what that decision was like, why you made it, or what the impact was, definitely would love to hear that.
Vishal, did you want to take that one
I think this is something that Vinay can speak to more, because I mean, it didn't really happen for me. I mean, but I think that's largely a function of just Screenhero didn't get that big. So I mean, I think Loom has gotten bigger, and so I think probably Vinay has more insight into this.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'll take it on. I think that, even early on when we were in the user testing days, we had to focus on business model. Like a user testing platform is not going to be, it's not going to be a ubiquity play. It's going to be a revenue play of some sort with traction, obviously, but some sort of revenue play. So we, generally speaking, I said this early on, but me and my co-founders didn't start a company to lose money. And so even though there's kind of the VC mentality of like grow really big and then figure out revenue later, like even right now with Loom, I really focus on the unit economics like quite a bit. I really think about OpEx and COGS. I think about engineering headcount because that's always going to be one of your most expensive resources and from a cost perspective. And so, I think that it's really important to think about the practicality of your business. I think that there are kind of two patterns that a lot of VCs at this point understand as anti-patterns that used to happen a lot and failed big. One is growth at all costs, like growth for only growth's sake, even though you know that there's nothing figured out about like how to make this thing viable. I think that you have to like figure it out and know that there's some like light at the end of the tunnel. The other thing that I would warn against is, bloating the team once you get VC money. And it's funny that I say that as like our engineering team is literally 5xing this year. But, when you grow, giving your team time to gel and building a team of highly effective people versus just hiring in silos and trying to solve problems that way. And all of a sudden you have like a lot of extra capacity. It's hard to move the ship, steer the ship, so to speak. Those are two things I'd think about from a business standpoint if you're asking about the technological feasibility. That being said, I fundamentally work off of like wanting to, like at first, like I said, it was more about just starting a successful company. And then with some merits of culture, now it's much more about, I know this is where the future is going and the technology happens to be difficult. Now I find myself in a position where I've developed more of a preference to work on things that have a technological angle. And even if I were to like start another company, I would pretty much make sure that was the case. But that's only my preference. I'd say that it really just depends on, if you start a Warby Parker, it might not be like the most technologically advanced thing, but there's an ops edge and there's an experience edge that's really compelling, right? And so I don't think that it's a one size fits all. I would say focus on the business model, have a preference, and make sure that you're keeping both in mind. And you can either go traction, knowing that there's some out, or revenue first, knowing that you just have the revenue and that the market is there to serve, whether it's like up market or mid market enterprise.
Thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Vishal. We have time for one more quick question. And this kind of is related to a lot of both of you have shared some really, really powerful principles and frameworks related to product, business model thinking, and economics and strategy and assessing product market fit. So Giles sent a message asking, do you think product thinking is something that any founders can do, or is it advisable to partner with somebody? So if you have an answer for that question, we'd love to hear it. But also if you have any resources to help somebody with their product thinking or with how to assess or understand business models and the types that might fit well. If you have any resources or people that you would point to do some research on their own, that would also be really awesome. So would love your insight and resources there.
I mean, my general thinking here is that, you know, if you are a founder and you want to be a founder of the team, it's critically important that you start thinking about solving user problems, whether or not you're fully on code, or whether, even if you were just fully on code and you don't really have to worry about it and you have a product co-founder, I would suggest trying to build up that muscle by finding someone who complements you and then building it up over time versus just focusing on code and not involving yourself at all in business decisions. Like, I think that you're missing out on a big part of what it means to truly be a founder, which is making your way through validating assumptions about what you're actually solving for your users. It also, like, that trickles down to being able to recruit people more effectively, even if you're just technical. Let's say that you want to be the CTO in the future or whatever. Being able to recruit people is a huge part of your job now. If you're able to eloquently talk about the journey, about like what market you're serving, why you're serving that market, where your different thoughts are, you'll earn a lot of respect within your company as it grows, and you'll earn it from the people that will be adding to your company. And so that's my general thinking. I think it's something that fundamentally you should want to do. If you don't do it at first and you don't have that muscle and you find someone who complements you, there's nothing wrong with that, but I would highly encourage going down the path and trying to build it up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, I think one thing that I like about, you know, being a founder is some of those lines between product person, a technical person, a business person that we have in kind of big organizations, they kind of melt away, you know. And I think, like Vinay is saying, you want people that are kind of want that. They want to kind of do a lot of different things. And if you don't know it, then you learn it either by doing it, or you learn it from your co-founders. And that's not to say everybody has equal skills and equal abilities necessarily, or even equal interests, but I definitely think that like everyone can and should be kind of have that sort of mindset of being involved in things like product, and also things like business strategy and marketing and customer support. You know, all of these things kind of feed into one another. It increases a sort of like alignment between the founders. Your kind of ability to move in a single direction is also just like, you know, more diversity of thinking around how to solve those problems. It's more fun, you know?
Absolutely. Thank you both. So we are at the end of our time together. Vinay, do you have any final words for everybody joining us here today about their founder's journey, or any final words of wisdom you want to leave with everyone?
You know, it's a super custom personal journey. Like there's so many different ways you can go about it. And I guess my last piece of feedback is that a lot of people end up going on this journey and realizing they really hate it. If you're in that camp, like, two pieces of advice that are diametrically opposed to each other, but are both true. One is that this doesn't have to be your last time that you try it. You could try it with like a different group of people. It'd be totally different. You could be in a different like area of your life. Don't give up hope. The other is that if you truly know you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. There's like, if you're looking for status validation, which is totally fine, we're all like humans, like there are other ways to get it. If you're looking for an early stage experience, you could be an early stage employee and ask for like a lot more equity than you would usually get elsewhere, and take on that risk. So I would just say that those are my two pieces of advice. Diametrically opposed, depends on where you're at.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vinay. And thank you, Vishal, for your thoughtful questions and guiding our conversation. And Vinay, thank you for sharing your story and sharing the insights in your journey. And I appreciate, and I just want to say thank you for everybody who joined and gave your time this evening if you're, you know, in the United States, but if you're elsewhere, if it's your morning, if it's your afternoon, or if it's your late night, thank you for spending your time with us. We hope it was impactful, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks everyone, and we will see you later.
Totally. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for putting this on. if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm writing in my Twitter handle. My DMs are open. Feel free to message me. Happy to answer any questions offline. Thanks, y'all.